5 patients, 12 experts, 45 academic medical articles. A tidal wave of regret is heading our way. Is our society equipped to face the harms of so-called gender-affirming care and to reckon with what the medical establishment has done to detransitioners? Learn what these brave souls have been through and how you can help. Watch our film, No Way Back: The Reality of Gender-Affirming Care. Formerly known as Affirmation Generation, we are proud to announce we have been picked up by a global distributor. The tide is turning. Visit our website at nowaybackfilm.com.
We need to get away from the fact that, brains have these chemical imbalances and we're being chemists and we're in there and we're rebalancing things and helping people. The right way to look at psychiatric medications is from a drug-centered model. And what that means is each drug has a signature drug effect and they can be leveraged in therapeutic ways. And the real benefit actually of looking at it as a drug-centered approach is you actually start to be way more well-informed about what the drugs are doing and you can monitor them in a much safer way. Because if you're giving someone who has severe anxiety an SSRI and you're saying, okay, maybe you're able to function a little bit better at work now, you're a perfectionist, work stresses were really pushing you over the edge. Well, I'm not just going to be interested in work now. How's this affecting your relationship? How is this affecting your ability to be in tune with your children, when they're going to come up to you and they're going to have problems? Are you going to be as attuned to them? What about your wife? So we start thinking more globally about what is the effect of this in all of your interactions in your life and your motivation and your dreams, and you can actually steer people in a better way, in therapeutically using these drugs rather than being like, oh, we fixed it, we fixed your chemical imbalance.
You must be some kind of therapist.
I am some kind of therapist, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the inner wilderness. I've invited brilliant guests from all walks of life to join me as we investigate, illuminate, and inspire transformation in ourselves, intimate relationships, and the social ecosystems we are constellated in. What you are about to hear may surprise you, so hang on to your earbuds for a hefty dose of sanity in a chaotic world. I am Stephanie Wynn, a licensed marriage and family therapist, branching out and building bridges between psychology and everything else under the sun. It's my honor to have you along for the ride. Let's get started.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. He is a board-certified psychiatrist, as well as a former FDA medical officer. He's a specialist in adverse drug reactions of psychiatric medications. He's the co-founder of Witt-Doerring Psychiatry, along with his wife, Dr. Marissa Witt-Doerring. Together, they provide a comprehensive drug taper program, conservative medication management, and supportive coaching for those withdrawing from psychiatric drugs. He's also the host of the podcast Life on Less Meds. You can find his podcast as well as shorter informational videos on his YouTube channel, Witt-Doerring Psychiatry. I originally found Dr. Yosef through a related Twitter account, not his own, at pssd network, which is the post-SSRI sexual dysfunction network. So that was a topic of interest because many who are familiar with this, either from personal experience or clinical experience, are aware that SSRIs, which are the most common class of antidepressants, often cause sexual dysfunction, not only during their use, but after as well. And so there was a Twitter account raising awareness about this issue, and I thought it would be something interesting to cover. But once I connected with Dr. Yosef, I realized he's really a wealth of information, and I'm excited to dive in. This conversation will pick up where episode 20, way back in the 20s, we're in the 70s now, episode 20 left off. You might remember, if you've been a longtime listener of the show, that I spoke with Dr. Roger McFillin in an episode called Mental Health in the Age of Misinformation. Dr. McFillin is very critical of the psychiatry field, and Dr. Yosef is as well. But what's really exciting is that he's actually a psychiatrist critical of psychiatry. So welcome, and thank you for speaking your mind freely, Dr. Yosef. It's great to have your expertise here.
Thank you for having me.
There's so many things we could get into. Post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, benzodiazepine withdrawal. Let's see if we can start with the basics. How did you end up going to psychiatry school only to find yourself working to help people get off of medication?
Yeah. I'll give you kind of the abbreviated version for that. I've thought about this a lot, actually. I look back at my life, and I was always really into self-help and psychology, like most people who go into mental health. You know, came from, I guess, some of my own deficits. I think growing up, at least, I did have a hard time kind of connecting with people. I kind of come from a pretty low EQ family, and that was just like one of my deficits. So meeting people, getting girlfriends, friends, all that kind of stuff was a little rocky. And I kind of ended up reading a lot about that. I was just like, oh my God, why is this so difficult for me? How can I improve on this? And I was super into it. And my mom is Chinese. So uh, the other thing is I had to become like a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer or something. So I went to medical school, still really interested in self-help, coaching, psychology, and then psychiatry just seemed like this kind of interesting thing. Oh wow, I can share kind of my love for personal development and such with this field of medicine that might have something to do with that. And anyway, so I end up becoming a psychiatrist. I come to the US and study, and I discover that the way we are helping people in psychiatry has nothing to do with like really like personal development, at least in the field of psychiatry. It's kind of this production line that just kind of flicks meds at people, and is kind of dressed up in a lot of this science about you know whether there are neurological deficits for some people, chemical imbalances, deficits in brain-derived neurotrophic factors, or whatever the chemical of the day was, that was getting spat out. But all of this stuff was kind of being packaged in this model to kind of just say, we need to give people more medications. And that's how all of the services were set up. It sits like poorly with me kind of immediately when I go there. I'm just like, hey, we're not really like helping these people. Like someone's come into my clinic and they've been molested, or, there's some contextual stress that's causing a lot of anxiety. And this appointment is really like geared towards like, oh, you have these symptoms now, you have depression and you should be on this drug. And I'm looking around and I'm kind of seeing everyone practicing in this way, and I see a lot of my colleagues, and they're not really having a problem with this. They're giving themselves pats on the back. They feel like this is really evidence-based. And I start looking into the clinical research, and I start learning from people like David Healy, Joanna Moncrieff, Robert Whitaker, some of these people that are putting out more critical thoughts. And I realized that they're right. And I realized that if anyone actually looked at the literature with a critical eye for more than like 5 minutes, they would realize that a clinical trial for an antidepressant, which is 8 to 12 weeks long, where the primary outcome measure is a reduction in symptoms of depression, doesn't really tell us shit about what it's doing, because it's just saying, we're going to constrict your emotions, we're going to lower you down on this scale, and we're going to say we're going to treat your depression. The fact of the matter is, this doesn't make sense for the majority of people who end up on these drugs for decades. But we have this whole kind of system that's cheerleading people onto these drugs, and I was going crazy. I'm just like, how does no one see this? Like what we're doing like makes no sense long term. Like you must be seeing the same thing, but again, we're all kind of like lulled into this state where, oh, the chairman of our department and the professors, they're pumping out this clinical research, they're talking at these conferences, they're working with pharmaceutical companies. They're not saying anything. So like, there's nothing wrong. And so the more I sit there, I get kind of pissed off with sort of like the careerism of everything. It ends up being this thing where I think there's a lot of ethical compromise, and I think a lot of people are trying to kind of do well in their career. So they get involved in this kind of research. They make sure they don't say things that kind of might upset where funding is coming from. And I actually think about quitting. And I just go, I don't want to be kind of, looped in with a bunch of people who are like, just kind of drugging people instead of actually helping them. And I want to say this, I think there is a case for some drugs and some serious mental illness and things like that. There's always a place for it, but we're at a point where they're just giving out like 90% more than they should be. Like 1 in 10 people on them like might actually need them. The rest of it is just like they're probably made worse by it. That's my opinion, just on what I'm seeing on the ground. And so I think about quitting. In fact, I actually get in trouble a lot during residency for just being insubordinate and like having the wrong ideas. And my wife ends up telling me that I should stay. And I end up having some actually good professors. They channel this towards doing some research. I end up publishing book chapters and getting involved, like talking about drug side effects and things like that. And then, I went to the FDA as a medical safety officer in the division of psychiatry, starting to learn about, how do government agencies assess side effects, risks? How do they communicate them to the public and drug labels? And then I also end up going to pharma, and I work in 3 different pharmaceutical companies for clinical research and drug safety roles. Eventually decide that I'm kind of done being quiet about this. And this is actually at the start of the year. I quit my pharma job and really kind of revved up my practice and became very vocal online about a lot of the problems that I was seeing. And my practice right now, like if you come to see me in my practice, 2 things are going on with you. You either have protracted withdrawal injury, you've tried to come off an antidepressant or a benzodiazepine and you've sustained neurological damage. That's one group. The other group of people are polydrugged on several medications. They're coming to the realization that they're just getting made worse by being on multiple drugs, and they need someone to help untangle like a mess of medications. And so that's my new kind of bread and butter. And that's a long answer, but that's kind of the story.
I love that there's a place for you in psychiatry and that there are people who need a doctor that's willing to be honest with them, and that you've carved out this niche. It seems like there's really a lot of potential to help people. And so earlier you described that a lot of the so-called evidence used to support the use of psych meds, especially antidepressants, are these short-term clinical trials where they're showing 8 to 12 weeks there's a reduction in distress due to numbing, but that doesn't really make sense if these drugs are going to be used by people for years on end. And so something I want to clarify for our listeners, because not everybody knows this, I have therapists in my audience, but also people from all walks of life, is that when it comes to a diagnosis of major depression, you only have to have that diagnosis, or you only have to have clinically significant symptoms for 2 weeks to meet the criteria for major depressive disorder single episode. Whether that single episode is mild, moderate, or severe, or you may have recurring episodes or they may last longer. If they're 2 years without more than 2 months of relief, then that's persistent depressive disorder. And sometimes that can get labeled as treatment resistant. But that was something that I noticed in one of these trainings that I went to years ago, because as a therapist, you're encouraged to go to trainings put on by psychiatrists. And I remember looking at the outcomes of one of these studies and saying, well, there was a reduction in distress after X amount of time, but you're looking at major depressive disorder. That means that this might have been a time-limited condition in the first place. So why would people stay on it? Another thing I think we need to be talking about more in the culture in general is that a lot of people I see in my therapy practice, especially like people in their 20s, have been on meds for depression and anxiety for years, maybe since they started adolescence, and nobody ever told them. No therapist, no psychiatrist, or primary care physician ever told them this diagnosis, whether it's major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, which, by the way, is a 6-month, you have to have symptoms for 6 months to qualify for that criteria, that this isn't a life sentence. It's not like saying you have diabetes, right? It's not like saying there's this thing that's permanent about you. It's that you can have these symptoms for a period of your life, and it could be in relation to all kinds of things. And so I think you and I, in our own ways, are both asking the question, why would you put people on drugs that are really hard to get off of, or put them on drugs without any plan to get off of them, for something that is actually quite likely to be time limited?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it makes no sense to me. I can give you some comments about like why I think it is the way that it is. Like, I mean, there was this whole thing about the chemical imbalance, which has been, that was sort of like the Trojan horse of how they introduced a lot of the antidepressants back then. oh, we give people these drugs, they look better, and they do look better. I mean, these drugs are psychoactive, and if you have someone who has severe anxiety and you give it to them, it's going to blunt it and they'll look better. Maybe because we know this drug affects serotonin, that they have some kind of serotonin imbalance or something like that. Okay, yeah, there's some plausibility there. And so there was this idea that a lot of this mental illness was really biological in nature, stemming from kind of innate dysfunctions in your head. And it's complicated, right? Because we do know that there are psychiatric illnesses that really are genetic and really do come out of nowhere. I mean, you have, like some people with schizophrenia, some people with bipolar disorder. There are severe forms of depression which come out of the blue with no contextual stresses. There's nothing in the diet that's going to do anything about that. And so you have this kind of category of mental illnesses that really are diseases, and they exist. And for a long time, that's kind of what psychiatrists dealt with. But then in around the 50s, with the advent of a lot of the newer drugs like Librium, like the benzodiazepines, the antipsychotics, and the antidepressants, oh my God, there's a market opportunity. And it's not like this crazy calculated thing, or maybe it is. But the way I think about it was there was suddenly a massive incentive to sell these new medications, and so we start talking a lot more about depression or anxiety disorders and juvenile bipolar disorder and things like that. And because there's such a financial incentive now, they're turning up in medical journals and conferences. And again, you talked about social contagion, but that's where it really begins. When there's a group of people who have like an agenda to get the message out about something, it kind of takes on a life of its own. And so while like mental illness, it used to be, oh yeah, this is probably biological, it starts to kind of eat all of these normal things up, like all of this kind of garden variety depression and anxiety from contextual stresses and things that just like happen in people's lives. They start being kind of, oh, this is major depressive disorder. It's just like the other stuff. And it's not, it's mostly contextual based on contextual stresses, and it gets better. But that's how a lot of it is being described from like from like an individual person sense as well. Like sometimes it's like a lot easier actually for someone to grab onto a diagnosis, especially if they're really confused about what's going on with them. And that's really easy. I think about people who have like trauma or abusive households and things like that, or who are struggling to find themselves. If someone comes along and tells you you have a mental illness, that's like a really clean way to kind of understand what's going on. And there can be some benefit in that simplicity, but it ends up being really misleading. And so I guess the original question, coming back to that was, why, I think it was why are so many people being kind of diagnosed with this thing that sounds like long-term and permanent? There's a bunch of highly resourced people who are, kind of putting out information that makes it seem like that. And there's massive misunderstanding of, the medical literature supporting, the utility of that all over the place.
Treatment isn't really based on informed consent, then, is it? If you're not given accurate information about your diagnosis and prognosis, then how is that informed consent? And then there's the element of consenting to the possible long-term effects of these drugs, which is something that you specialize in. Before we get into that, though, you mentioned sort of the chemical imbalance hypothesis. And I've been hearing lately that that's been debunked, but I haven't really looked into it myself. I was curious if you had anything to say about that. And also if you have anything to say about Chris Palmer. Do you know him? His
Yeah,
approach, the metabolic,
sure.
he makes a good case in his book Brain Energy, which I'm reading right now, that all mental disorders that aren't just in reaction to a life stressor are essentially metabolic disorders of the brain. So, how is the field of psychiatry evolving in its understanding of, is it a chemical imbalance? Is it a metabolic disorder? Is it an electrical thing? What's going on in there? Or is it a microbiome thing?
Yeah, so let me break it down piece by piece. Yeah. So the chemical imbalance has been, I guess, quote unquote, debunked. Why has it been debunked? Yeah, because we got a bunch of people who had like problems with like depression, and then we stuck needles in their spine and we measured the level of serotonin, and it was completely normal compared to people who were not depressed. Okay, no chemical imbalance. It's still used as like almost like a meme, as this easily understandable way to kind of tell people to, oh, there's something wrong. Over time, it's been kind of replaced by other things like, oh, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, you have deficits in that, and if you take an antidepressant, it's helping the brain's neuroplasticity. They'll always kind of swap in like a new biological like explanation for mental illness.
But
I
don't you
think
think,
yeah.
sorry, I know you're in the middle of something
hmm
here, but when it comes to brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF, it's my understanding as a layperson that that is really important and that exercise, I mean, that's why is one of the big reasons that exercise is so good for our mental health. Do you disagree on BDNF?
Yeah, I think it's a load of shit. I think
Hmm.
like it's, you cannot say that someone has like a depressive or an anxiety disorder because of some like chemical in the brain. I mean, we know it's so much more complicated than that. There's contextual stresses. And so I really take a strong stance there. Anyone that's looking for like a boiled down reductionist view of like, oh, if I can just fix the BDNF in there, if I can just fix my neuroplasticity, like everything is going to be better. Sure, maybe it's like one factor, maybe it plays like a 5% role in it, but focusing on that, massively misleading to people.
Hmm.
And it's that whole thing of like, it's knowing like why you take the drugs. And I'll tell you about Joanna Moncrieff's work, who you may be familiar with already, but she was kind of like the antidote to the chemical imbalance theory. And she says we need to get away from the fact that brains have these chemical imbalances, and we're being chemists and we're in there and we're rebalancing things and helping people. The right way to look at psychiatric medications is from a drug-centered model. And what that means is each drug has a signature drug effect, like alcohol or opiates or methamphetamine, and they can be leveraged in therapeutic ways. Serotonin antidepressants, for instance, like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, they are emotional constrictors. These drugs don't make people feel better. They reduce anxiety. That is like the drug effect if you talk to people. It usually kicks in over a week to 2 weeks, to, several weeks. That's a drugged feeling that can be totally therapeutic. And I'm not going to say it's always bad to be on these drugs. If you have mega severe OCD, anxiety, you've had it since birth, and you're going to kill yourself, and this is the only way that you can survive, take that Zoloft. That's a good risk benefit equation, and you should be glad that we have that drug. But you shouldn't be taking it thinking that it's like fixing a chemical imbalance. You should be taking it just being like, there's a therapeutic drug effect here. Okay, I'm going to use it. Maybe use it sparingly because of that, because there's dependence and things like that. Same with psychosis, Risperdal, Haldol, all of these drugs. They're not fixing the underlying cause of your schizophrenia. It's not like a vitamin for your brain. You have schizophrenia, you have psychosis, you have paranoia for reasons that we don't understand yet, and we're looking into it. But when you take this drug, it's going to constrict those thoughts. It's going to turn the volume down so you can function. And the real benefit, actually, of looking at it as a drug-centered approach is you actually start to be way more well-informed about what the drugs are doing, and you can monitor them in a much safer way. Because if you're giving someone who has severe anxiety an SSRI, and you're saying, okay, maybe you're able to function a little bit better at work now, you're a perfectionist, work stresses were really pushing you over the edge. Well, I'm not just going to be interested in work now. How's this affecting your relationship? How is this affecting your ability to be in tune with your children, when they're going to come up to you and they're going to have problems? Are you going to give a shit like you used to? Are you going to be as attuned to them? What about your wife? So we start thinking more globally about what is the effect of this in all of your interactions in your life and your motivation and your dreams, and you can actually steer people in a better way, in therapeutically using these drugs rather than being like, oh, we fixed it, we fixed your chemical imbalance. It's like, and that's actually a way more fulfilling way to practice psychiatry, and it's a reason why I think that family medicine doctors unless they're willing to do this, should have no part in prescribing these medications, because you cannot do that in a 15-minute appointment. You can't do it in a 30-minute appointment. You need to know people and you need to know about their lives if you're going to be tinkering with their chemistry, and it's going to be affecting their relationships. So yeah,
This brings us
that's my
to
download.
the
Yeah,
combination
yeah.
of emotional blunting and sexual side effects. So something interesting that I learned recently is that, well, I knew this about painkillers, whether we're talking about opiates or just your common household ibuprofen, for example, that physical and emotional pain in the brain are very linked, and that when you take a pain reliever, it also can have an emotional numbing effect, and that the SSRIs and other antidepressants do something similar where yes, they make your own pain less, but they also reduce your ability to feel the pain of others. So that's some of that relational difficulty that you're talking about.
Hmm. Totally. Yeah, yeah. The impact on relationships from these medications can be severe, and it can go in a lot of different dimensions. And I know opiates, yes, people think painkillers, but they're massive anxiety reducers as well. Anyone who's ever taken these medications know that they kind of lull you into this, sense of comfort. They really reduce anxiety, and they used to be used for that for, in the past before, obviously they cause horrific dependence and they're difficult, and so they're not used for that now. But how can these drugs mess with your relationship, right? And I had this experience. I took Zoloft for a little bit as like an experiment, and my wife took it as well, and we were kind of seeing like what it did. She became more energized. She had a really hard time sleeping. She became more kind of irritable in the days that she took it. I was shut down. I mean, I took it irresponsibly. I really wanted to see what it would do. I think I started at like 50 and put myself on 100 within 2 or 3 days. That's like a faster kind of increase than you should do. But I had a lot of emotional blunting, and I just remember her like being upset with me, and I was just sitting on the couch, and it was just so easy just to just be like, oh yeah, that's okay, and just kind of dismiss it. And I was just kind of thinking about this disconnected state, and that's what it felt like to me. I felt disconnected from my emotions. How like um how damaging it could be in a relationship, because my wife told me, like, when we came out of it, she's like, I hated you on Zoloft. Like, you were so disconnected. And some of that may be, in general, I'm very I in general I have a hard time kind of with others, and it's kind of like this journey of me kind of always like trying to be attuned to how other people are feeling. And so you put that on top of me, and it kind of pushes me into this place where I'm like very not aware of other people. But over time, the stories that I heard, um, working with clients is like, yeah, shut down, blunted, having a hard time connecting. Used to like care about like my children being upset. Then I got on the medication and I just like didn't. I came out of it and I was just like devastated, realizing I'd just been ignoring my child, like playing computer games when they'd be coming up to me. I mean, the sexual dysfunction side of things is, while you're on the drug, you're not interested in sex, and it's twofold. One, it shuts down that kind of libido. So there's a psychological component which is like constricted. There's less of that desire to have sex, but it also makes it difficult for you to have an erection or to be interested in sex, just like the mechanical parts of it. And I know we'll talk about pssd later, but in a very in a smaller proportion of people, um, it endures. When they come off the drugs, they still have kind of horrific sexual dysfunction and emotional blunting for a really long time, and that's just a nightmare. And the other thing that sometimes happens on these medications is people get really disinhibited. They'll start an SSRI and they'll go out and they'll have an affair, or they'll do something like that, so it can just, there's so many ways. Like, if you're not monitoring this carefully with a professional, things can get out of hand like very quickly. And then like you go and see the doctor and they tell you have like a bipolar disorder or something like that. You get shunted towards more medications because they're not aware of what they're really doing to people.
That's a phenomenon in and of itself. People with no prior history of mania having a manic reaction to antidepressants, then being labeled bipolar. But before we go any further into that, I interrupted you several minutes ago when I asked you what you thought of Chris Palmer's brain energy hypothesis, and you were
Mm.
about to share, and then I cut you off. So, what did you want to say about that?
Oh yeah, Chris Palmer's brain energy, like it's this like unifying hypothesis that you know, dietary problems, psychological stress, toxins, anything like the way that causes mental illness is it impairs, like, I guess, the way the mitochondria function in the cells, and that does it. So as a unifying theory, I think it's I think it's okay, for what's going on there. I mean, that kind of makes sense to me as like as a framework, but in terms of like the practical world, I don't know. Like, I think there's some practical things in his book, which is really like, be very like mindful of like your diet, be very mindful that a lot of medications can actually impair your, the way your cells produce energy. And when I spoke to him, he says most of his work now is pulling people off medications which are just, he thinks, are causing impairment of in cellular function. And he's probably the most well known for like the ketogenic diet. I mean, he has a lot of talks about how ketones are a much more efficient source of fuel for mitochondrial functioning. And so I like Chris. I think he's really smart and has a lot of good things to say.
It also raises the question that if some of these more commonly used psychiatric medications that are supposed to help people with depression, anxiety, or even psychosis, if their side effects include weight gain and metabolic disruption, then aren't they causing the very problem that they're supposed to be solving, according to this hypothesis?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. They can be a double-edged sword. Yes, there's a direct drug effect that is blunting and that can be therapeutic for someone. But if it's making you obese, like a lot of the medications do, then it's going to be working against you as well. Totally.
I have so many questions for you.
Uh-huh.
One is, when people are starting to come off of medication, which I know is your primary area of focus, is helping people with that, how can they tell the difference between withdrawal symptoms versus, oh, this is me unmedicated? In other words, this is how crazy I am. This is how depressed or dysfunctional I really am. And this is why I need meds. This is why I went on meds in the first place. Maybe I can't trust myself to come off of meds.
Mhm. Um, Sometimes it's super obvious, and sometimes it's not. I think we've been like lulled into a place where people don't really pay attention to symptoms anymore. They're just like, oh, it's depression. Like, well, what does that mean? Oh, it's 5 out of 9 symptoms. Well, which 9? Oh, and which 5 should it be? Any 5 of them. So I mean, you could technically have like a complete a combination of everything, and it could look a million different ways, but that's not really what it looks like. I mean, it's not that random. Again, I'm shooting from the hip here. This is not a consensus. This is just one man and his journey trying to figure things out. Depression looks a certain way most of the time, and I'm going to talk about your garden variety contextual stress depression. Usually it evolves from anxiety. You have someone who's in an impossible situation, very conflicted, doesn't know which way to go. They feel hopeless. They feel very, very anxious, and then they fall into a state of hopelessness and apathy and sadness, and they just feel trapped. To me, that's
Boom.
depression. Yeah, and like they have
We don't acknowledge
insomnia.
that often enough. I just want to highlight how important
Yeah,
what you just said is, because
yeah.
people talk about depression and anxiety, oftentimes lumping them together or talking about them as if they're completely separate issues. But how depression originates from anxiety,
Hmm.
that's, you just nailed it so beautifully.
Yeah.
Please continue.
And most mental health professionals know this. If you're dealing with these people and they're coming in through your door, that's what you're seeing. And so so it has a clinical course. It has symptoms which are fairly common. You won't find this in the DSM. I don't know. It ends up being kind of common sense eventually over time. And so when someone's coming off these medications, I'm comparing it to their baseline. How were you feeling, when the depression evolved? sometimes it's like really confusing, right? Because they'll have that depression that evolved and they're like, I was really depressed for like 2 years and then I decided to take something. And so we kind of focus on how they felt then. And then they get on like drugs for like 2 or 3 years and they're just like, I don't know how I feel now. I'm all discombobulated. Maybe it's kind of helping me. Maybe it's giving me this weird anxiety. And so then there's that period where they have this kind of like, it's somewhat therapeutic because it's suppressing some things, but there's also this kind of like chemical component to what's going on. And then there's that. And then there's the withdrawal period. And so when I'm withdrawing people off the medications, I'm always kind of thinking in my mind, like, how did they feel like right at the start before they got on this? And that's most important when I guess the withdrawal symptoms or the symptoms that are happening then are purely like psychiatric. And because that's when it's the most confusing. I work with a lot of people who they have neurotoxicity from the drugs. And so if they start complaining about like shooting pains, like dizziness, headaches, gastrointestinal symptoms, like, when we're pulling people off these drugs, it's going to have global neurological side effects. So if it's coming in a constellation of symptoms where it's not just emotional and psychiatric, it's much more likely that these are withdrawal symptoms. And so that's kind of how I'm teasing these things out. And it's also a clinical course. Like if I just did a reduction, a 10% drop or a 20% drop on a medication, I look at the half-life of the medication and say, okay, well, 5 terminal half-lives is about, 5 days later, this should be when things kick in. And if it kind of lines up with that they had a flare-up of some symptoms, I'm going to say, okay, the timeline fits that this group of symptoms that just emerged, they're likely related to me withdrawing the drug.
How are you sleeping? Sleep is a foundation of mental and physical health, equally important to nutrition and exercise, yet it's often the first thing to go during times of stress. Good sleep can help alleviate depression and anxiety symptoms, maintain a healthy weight and metabolism, protect your heart, and even reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. Yet still, a third of Americans struggle with sleep, and temperature is one of the main reasons. Before I got an 8 sleep, I was already an expert in sleep hygiene and practiced what I preach to my clients. But I would still wake up overheated in the middle of the night and unable to fall back asleep for 1 or 2 hours. Adjusting the air temperature and blankets was not enough. The mattress itself was keeping me hot. But now, I'm sleeping soundly through the night and waking up refreshed thanks to my 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover. The Pod Pro cover by 8 Sleep is the most advanced solution on the market for thermoregulation. It pairs dynamic cooling and heating with biometric tracking. The cover can adjust the temperature on each side of the bed individually for you and your partner based on your sleep stages, biometrics, and bedroom temperature, reacting intelligently to create the optimal sleeping environment. If you'd like to be more patient with your children, more emotionally stable with your partner, a fitter athlete, or more efficient at work, take it from me, a mental health professional. Improving your sleep is one of the best investments you can possibly make in your overall well-being and the lives of everyone you touch. Go to 8sleep.com to check out the pod and use the code SOMETHERAPIST at checkout to start sleeping cool this summer with up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. And yes, to my listeners around the world, 8 Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. All right, now back to the show.
And what type of support do people need through that rocky period? Because I've heard it can be hell. I mean, on your YouTube channel, you mentioned brain zaps that are common with withdrawing from. What's the one that's famous for the brain zaps? I always forget.
What's it called? So Paxil
Effexor?
soup, Paxil and
Oh,
Effexor are like really, really bad. Yeah.
yeah. So during that rocky period where people's nervous systems are all over the place, they're maybe experiencing brain zaps, other withdrawal symptoms. What are the worst hurdles to overcome, and how do you get people through that time?
hmm So the main thing is you want to do a controlled withdrawal because you can really make someone's life miserable to the point where they want to kill themselves. And so the goal is that you withdraw the medications at a rate that's not too destabilizing. So if you have someone on, effects of the bad one, you're talking about 300 milligrams, a high dose, of that, we're not going to just, well, let's say, for instance, like, we drop them down by like 10% and they have brain zaps and they have a decrease in their level of functioning. So I always look at their level of functioning. Withdrawal is usually not easy. I mean, we're putting you into an unbalanced chemical state. And so I say, they'll usually say, I'm more anxious, I'm a little irritable, but I'm still able to function. I'm still able to go to work. I'm still able to look after my children, still able to do the things I usually do. Great. We're going to continue at that dose reduction, 10% from the starting dose the whole way down. If they come and tell me, hey, that reduction totally destabilized me, like I'm having like burning pains in my hands, I'm getting zaps, I haven't gone to work 3 days this week, I'll go, oh shit, we're going to pull you back up, and the next reduction is going to be 50% of that, because it's not like a sprint, it's kind of like a marathon. So I'm trying to bring people down in a way that's giving their brain a chance to kind of rebuild itself as I gradually remove this. So the main thing of helping people get through this is to not do it too fast. It needs to be completely paced with the person you're working with. And so it's very reactive. You want to check in fairly frequently and kind of get it at the rate that works for them. That's like the main thing.
Are there any additional tools besides medications, any lifestyle interventions or practices that can help people cope with those withdrawal symptoms better?
Sure. Yeah. So the main ones, like, and not to get into the weeds, a lot of people want to, should I take this supplement? Should I do this and that? I'm going to boil it down to you. There's a few simple things. Stop stimulants. If you're using caffeine or nicotine, cut it out. You can cold turkey stop those ones. It'll make your withdrawal about 1,000 times easier. Maybe not 1,000 times, maybe like
Easier
3
said
times
than done,
easier.
my
Yep.
friend. Stop
It's
stimulants.
stop stimulants. Yep. And so that's like the first thing. Like, you're most of the way there, and it's, especially if we're talking about a sedative. Like, if you're coming off Xanax and you think you're going to do that on caffeine and nicotine, man, are you making things more difficult for yourself? Something that could have taken you 9 months is going to take you a year and a half, because you're just not going to tolerate it as well. The other thing that you want to keep in mind, like, I don't tell people to get in the weeds with supplements. I advocate like a generally healthy diet. If you have never done gluten-free, if you've never done dairy-free, a lot of my patients have tried that, like an elimination style diet, and it helps them. Do I think it's something specifically with withdrawal that it's helpful? No. Do I think it's something that for some people has a massive impact on just their general well-being, in many aspects of their health, and maybe that helps with withdrawal? Yeah, changing diet does. And so stop stimulants and try a new diet, I think, is really helpful. And the other thing really is, like, it's like a tapering strategy as well. For instance, you want to come off your benzodiazepine, but you're taking several other medications, like maybe you're taking Strattera, maybe you're taking like Wellbutrin. We're going to taper you off stimulating medications first, because I know that if I reduce your benzodiazepine, you're going to lose that sedative cover, and you're going to have a harder time during withdrawal. So there's a way that you can pull off medications in a strategic manner that will lessen the symptoms during withdrawal and ultimately make it a faster and smoother way out for someone.
And here I am just caught on the part where you suggest that someone would even be on both a benzo and a stimulant at the same time. And I'm thinking, who put that person on these drugs? So
Well,
many places.
they overshot with the benzo, and so they need something to help them get up in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, at what point is this no longer psychiatry, but just mixing uppers and downers? I mean, like, how is that any different from someone, snorting cocaine and then drinking to fall asleep? I mean, it's that's a little more extreme, but arguably not that much more. So I do want to talk about benzodiazepine over prescription. But you also mentioned an elimination diet, and that reminded me of something. So I had an aunt with schizophrenia or schizoaffective, actually. And she had it from before I was born all the way until she died a few years ago in a very unhealthy state. And in college, I briefly took a class. Unfortunately, I had to drop it because I was taking too many credits, but it was fascinating for the first few weeks that I was there on nutritional psychology. And my professor had an interesting story where his daughter had exhibited prodromal symptoms and then eventually full blown symptoms of psychosis in early adulthood, which is usually when it comes on. Right. So, for those who aren't familiar, if someone is going to develop schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, usually the signs start to come on in the early 20s or so. That was what was happening with his daughter. And they actually were able to trace the psychotic symptoms to a gluten allergy. And when they removed gluten from her diet, her psychotic symptoms went away. And hearing that story just blew my mind because I have seen firsthand from a very young age what a diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective can do to someone. It can completely take your life away. It can make you completely dependent on others and unable to function, to get a job, to have a relationship, to do anything meaningful, or to be physically active and healthy. And so to think that there's even one person in the world who is on that track to lose their entire future, where this could be stopped by removing something from their diet, just floored me. And it made me that much more upset that nobody had ever tried any nutritional interventions with my aunt. Not that she would have, I mean, she would have put up a fight. She was eating a gallon of ice cream a day, but how how common is that? To what extent do hidden allergies or nutritional imbalances, I know like nutritional deficiencies like B vitamin deficiencies, which are really common in vegans, for example, can cause OCD and even psychosis symptoms. So do you encounter that in your practice and do you work with nutrition?
Um, I I don't, and I guess I'll say it's not really my specialty. I think talking to Chris Palmer, he seems to do a lot more of that just from the talks that I've heard him give. But I think the story is a good one that people have noticed these things. I know Chris has noticed these things before, like putting people on ketogenic diets, and they come out of like decades of psychosis. It's definitely. I mean, I don't think it's going to work for everyone, but it's maybe there are autoimmune components to psychosis. I think that's very possible. I mean, we see lots of autoimmune conditions like lupus and autoimmune encephalitis cause psychosis. And so if you remove things like gluten, if you remove other drugs which are revving up your autoimmune system to the point where it crosses a threshold and then it's like messing with your brain and your neurons in some way, if you reduce the amount of inflammation in your body by changing your diet, maybe you pop below that threshold and now you don't need Risperdal or long-term antipsychotic treatment and all of the things that go along with that. So I mean, in a perfect world, what I would tell everyone to do is, if you're thinking about getting on a medication, stop caffeine, stop nicotine, fix your diet, and then just wait. Like those are the main things. If you were just going to keep it simple, um, where and if things are still really like rocky after that, then maybe have a think about it. But if you haven't done those things, I think you could. I mean, and stop using drugs and alcohol. I should have said that as well. If you've done those things, then you're in a better place to make a good decision about whether to take medication or not.
Help me with this stop caffeine thing because, here I am on behalf of, three-quarters of American citizens going over my dead body. It's
Sure.
like such a
Yeah.
part of our culture. That said, I mean, I think there's something kind of in American culture where there's like the wine mom meme, and then there's also the not before I've had my coffee meme. And some people really overdo it. I'm like a one or two cup a day kind of girl myself. That said, you say quit caffeine like it's easy. I'm sure you've had people put up a fight on this one. Why is it important to quit caffeine? And what kind of
Yeah.
supports can someone put into place to help? I mean, because caffeine withdrawal itself, I'm sure, is just as
Brutal.
harsh as the withdrawal from psychiatric meds. How do you
I'll
convince
tell
people
you
to
a
do that?
story. I'll tell you a story just so people know my bias towards it and why I say it so strongly. I I used to live in Texas, and I would chew tobacco, and I would also drink coffee, and I was fine for several years until I had my daughter. This is about 3 years ago. I left residency. I went and worked in a pharmaceutical company, super stressful, a lot of academic stresses. It's completely non-clinical. Clinical research, it's like learning a new career. Things went higher, more caffeine, more nicotine. I went to the FDA. That was a whole new job in regulation. It got, in drug regulation, it got out of control. I got to a point where I was drinking, this would have been about a little over a year ago, where I was drinking a big cup of coffee in the morning and I was drinking like a soda around noon. And I was probably putting about 5 Zins in my mouth throughout the day. These are the nicotine pouches. Um, and I would go to sleep at, I would go to sleep at, I would feel so tired at 4 p.m. I could fall asleep. And I remember for a long time, this kind of fatigue and lethargy was building up. And I was thinking, oh, I have a young kid. I keep on doing these new jobs that are challenging, where I have all these demands. It's obvious that I'm irritable and tired, and I feel bad, and I want to crash. And but eventually, I got to a point where I'm like, this level of fatigue is not normal for someone my age. And I ended up going down a rabbit hole of something called like adrenal fatigue. I don't know how it ended up on my radar, but they were talking about, if you have like a stressful job. I had a stressful job. And if you were using things like stimulants, that kept on kind of exogenously, externally, chemically causing your adrenals to secrete extra cortisol, that you could actually burn out the system, that you could put too much pressure on the adrenals and you could end up in a state of lethargy. And I went down this rabbit hole, and I'll put my tin hat on now at the moment. And when I was in there, I encountered a lot of people saying, there's so much like pro caffeine kind of newspaper articles and things like that saying it, makes you live longer, this and that. And just like the pharmaceutical industry, when you have a group of people who are selling a product, you're more likely to get a positive spin on things. And so I was like, okay, well, I see the corollary. I'm already really familiar with that in pharma, and so maybe some of that's happening with coffee, because I'd heard a lot of positive things about coffee, um, and so I decided to stop and said maybe I have adrenal fatigue. And oh, sorry. In the meantime, I'd gone on YouTube, and if you're interested, you could kind of check this out on your own. Search what happened when I quit caffeine, and there's a bunch of like people who go on there and they talk for like 15 minutes about what happened to them. And so I seen like maybe 3 or 4 of these, and I'm just like, and I'd been drinking coffee since I was 16. Let me just say that as well. So I wasn't a dabbler. Um, and I said, okay, I'm done with it. Cold turkeyed myself from coffee and nicotine. At some point, I just said enough's enough. Absolute potato for 3 weeks was who I was, like shell of a person at work, like literally like a warm body sitting in a chair pretending to be a human that could do things like watching Netflix. That was me for 3 weeks, and then the craziest thing started to happen. I had more kind of, I was a lot more relaxed, and my energy levels went through the roof. Like while I used to kind of like crash, that wasn't happening anymore. I could work well into the evening. How sad is this? I used to hate reading books to my daughter at bedtime because I would be crashing from caffeine. It would just be this irritation that I would have to do, and that completely changed. I could sit there and enjoy reading books to her because I wasn't like crashing from all these stimulants during the day. And I started sleeping like a teenager. I would have these, like back when I was using a lot of stimulants, I would wake up in the middle of the nights sometimes and I'd never be able to get back to bed. I don't know if you've ever had this, but you like wake up and you feel it in your stomach. It's like, that there's like a little adrenaline surge. There's something going on and you're like, I'm up. It is what it is. Completely went away. I would be able to fall asleep at night really easily. And I mean, my own story with Xanax actually started through this because I was on and off for several years, I was taking Xanax because my sleep was so disrupted. And so everything went away. I used to have chronic back pain, and then that went away as well. And so this is not going to happen for everyone. This is probably it's an anecdote. It's what happened to me. If you're just having coffee, it probably won't happen to you. But if you're in this picture where maybe you're on coffee and you're on nicotine or you're on like these stimulants and you come off them, give it a go. Try it for like a month to 2 months and just see what happens to your mood and your irritability, your anxiety. Another thing was I got so much faster at work. I used to nitpick over little things like a perfectionist. What completely went away. And so there was all these tiny little things that I noticed that improved. Oh, I used to drink like 3 like White Claws a night because I was crashing as well. So it just ended up being this thing that was this gateway drug in a way where like all of a sudden I'm drinking alcohol and I'm on like Xanax and so all of it stopped, no cravings, everything went away, like my back stopped hurting and so it had a massive effect on me. I ended up making my wife do this as well. She did not notice as big of a change as me. The only thing that she noticed really was that she completely stopped craving alcohol in the evening. You know, we would drink wine at night. And so I'm not going to say this is going to happen to you, but if you see yourself in the story of someone who's having these like weird episodes of fatigue and things like that, drop it for like a couple of months. It may change your life. And so that's the story. That's where I like come from and why I always make people do it. And it's not just me in the benzo community as well. This is really common knowledge. Everyone will say, you know, drop stimulants before you start to taper a sedative. It just makes things easier. But kind of give you a bit of color about where I come from on that.
Well, you've walked the talk. So, how did you will yourself to survive those 3 weeks? And what encouragement or resources do you give people who are trying to deal with that awkward phase?
How did I get through it? Honestly, like I don't know. I think I was so bought in, like I'd convinced myself at that point, like that it was almost like toxic for me in some way that I was super motivated to give it a go. But I think you need to get yourself ready to pretend to be a human like at work is the main thing. It's like you're not going to be able to do anything. Like and it's like, do you need to take some time off? Do you need to get really good at just doing like the bare minimum? I mean, it's like the main things for me, like I didn't have the headaches. Thankfully, I know some people have ripping headaches when they come off it. Mine was just like the most profound apathy and lack of desire to do anything. I mean, the hardest part for me was how unhappy my wife was with me because like she would just see someone who was just like laying in bed watching like Netflix, like straight up in like the middle of the day, like just like no nothing. But when I turned a corner, she was like, "Oh my God, I have like my husband back. You know, he's not this like cranky grouch that he used to be."
Mm, wow, fascinating.
Yeah,
All right, let's
yeah,
talk about benzodiazepines.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so you've talked about benzodiazepine overprescription as well as withdrawal.
Mhm.
And I want to first frame the issue of overprescription. So, first of all, when we talk about benzos, for people who don't know what that means, can you rattle off some drug names that that's referring to?
Yeah, Xanax, Klonopin, Valium, Temazepam,
Ativan.
Ativan. Yeah, it's a class of medications that came onto the US market in the 50s, probably the most commonly prescribed drugs, you know, prior to the 70s. People started to learn that they were like kind of bad around then, and then they've kind of become a little less popular, but they're still like massively used. The main issue with the benzos is that most people should know that they're a good short-term solution. You know, for less than like a month to 6 weeks, they're commonly prescribed for short-term anxiety. Think about someone like dying and you really need something for like a little bit and it's just keeping you together. That's okay. You know, think about safe use of benzos like you're going on an airplane and you're afraid of flying. That's okay. But the main issue is the people who get started on these medications by doctors and then they just get continued without anyone ever telling them that they have massive like opiate like fentanyl morphine levels of like dependence formation where like I mean it's even worse than that. Like some people, and this is not everyone, like But there is a group of people who get on these drugs and they can not stop it without severe problems. And that usually kicks in after, sometimes as soon as like a month, but usually it's after several months of use. You've changed your brain substantially to a level where you cannot just pull that drug out without it totally causing us severe symptoms.
So for people who aren't familiar with these drugs, basically they're downers, right?
Yeah.
They have an immediate anxiolytic or anxiety reducing impact, as opposed to something like SSRIs where you take it for a few weeks before you even notice anything. This is something where, just like a cup of coffee, you can feel it right away. When you take a benzo, you feel it right away. And so that's why they're good for those short term things, like um, often prescribed to people who have occasional panic attacks. It's something you could take if you were in a state of panic, that within a few minutes you would start to notice a difference. And it was always my understanding, as someone in the mental health field, that exactly what you said, right? That these are short term, usually given in small prescriptions to be taken occasionally under very particular circumstances. And so I was very disturbed when I noticed that every now and then I would see a patient who was given free rein by their psychiatrist to take a benzo daily. And I remember um, seeing this and having a conversation with the patient, like, so did they tell you that, like, what are the conditions under which this is prescribed? And that what I've sort of surmised from it is that there are maybe patients who are considered treatment resistant, or they've tried a bunch of different medications and don't work for them. And maybe this is somebody who's not really at a high functioning level. Maybe they're dependent on others. And it just seems like there's some psychiatrists kind of throw in the towel. All right, fine. You're gonna take benzos daily if that's what keeps you
Hmm.
from freaking out. Um, so, how common is this phenomenon of benzos being prescribed not for occasional use in high functioning people with occasional panic attacks or phobias, but for daily use? And where does that lead?
So I don't have the statistic, but I'd say it's pretty common. I'd say that everyone would probably know one or two people in this boat, kind of like your first, you know, uh, group of people around you who you know. Where does it leave people in this group? So I'm going to say the majority are okay. They take it, maybe even it's for 5 years or something like that. They decide to come off and they taper it in a couple of weeks, and it's okay, and they move on with their life. That's the majority of people. I don't want to scare you if you're on a benzodiazepine, but there is a group. Maybe it's 5%. Again, no one really knows because this is not what research studies are surrounded do. There is a group of people that when they start to lower the drug, they develop a full-blown neurotoxicity. Like, there is something about this medication that when you start to reduce it, maybe it's, because GABA is an inhibitor in neurotransmitter. It opposes another transmitter called glutamate, which is excitatory. And so this is all hypothesis right now, but maybe for some people, when you withdraw it, it causes too much of a surge in that excitatory neurotransmitter and it becomes toxic. It starts to damage neurons. And it's not just a withdrawal at that point. We're talking about brain damage. And it's not a return to the original symptoms because people, when they're going through this, they're not complaining about, oh, I have some insomnia or I have some anxiety. I mean, they have those things, but they start complaining about their muscles twisting underneath their skin, getting electric shocks, deafening ringing in their ears from tinnitus. Their system is so sensitized that they cannot even go to like a restaurant when there's people around them because just the sound and the light becomes overwhelming to them to the point it gives them a headache. They feel like they've been punched in the gut, just they constantly feel like winded. And the other thing is, for the vast majority of people who develop this toxicity during withdrawal, when you introduce the drug again, it doesn't go away. Meaning, you're not talking about withdrawal, you're talking about something that's damaged someone's nervous system. So you have someone who's got a neurotoxicity, drug reaction, and you've thrown the drug back on. It doesn't really do anything. Maybe it just superimposes that drug effect on top of this damaged nervous system. And people kill themselves when they're in this position. It's horrific. It can last several years. It has a great prognosis over time if you can keep people alive long enough. A lot of people are better by 2 years, but some people are still recovering like 5 years later, and sometimes even longer. Um, and it was only recently acknowledged by the FDA, like in I think it was 2019, end of 2019, they finally put it in the drug labels. But for a long time, these people just existed on forums like Benzo Buddies, kind of supporting each other while they were getting through. But yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. Like no one should take this medication unless they're aware that there's like, I don't know, a 1 in 20, 1 in 50, 1 in 100, who knows, chance that when you try and come off this drug, if you've been on it for longer than, a couple of months, it could actually ruin your life.
Wow. It's terrifying, and it's just so shocking that the doctors are doing this to people.
hmm Yeah, and that's like the interesting thing, right? So why are doctors still doing this to people, like when it's in all of the drug labels now? And the interesting thing was when the FDA updated the labels, they didn't do any like proactive risk mitigation, which is usually a dear doctor letter. You send letters to, the key prescribing groups. So for benzos, it would be gynecologists, family medicine doctors, psychiatrists, the groups that you think would do that kind of primary care type prescribing. They didn't do that. So they just kind of slid it into the label. And like, most doctors, they're not like reviewing the labels all the time or maybe engaged in looking at that stuff. So they don't know. And the worst thing is the ones that do know about this, who saw like the letter when it came out, they end up freaking out and they end up doing like rapid withdrawals on people. And that's actually how I get like a lot of people. There'll be like a little old lady who's like 75, who's been on this drug for 20 years, and the doctor looks at it and goes, "Oh wow, there's this terrible thing, with dependence on these medications. We're going to pull you off. I'm not prescribing it to you anymore." They get like rapid tapered, and because they do it too rapidly, they cause the protracted withdrawal injury. And that person would have been about 1,000 times better if they had just stayed on the drug until they died. But now they're in protracted withdrawal because frequently it's triggered by a rapid withdrawal. And then, they end up in like some detox or an inpatient psych unit. They get put on loads of gabapentin or Seroquel or something like that, and they just are functioning so poorly.
That's really scary.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that I have such a highly sensitive nervous system because I can feel these things right away. The few times that I've taken a benzo for short-term anxiety, I feel the withdrawal effects like 6 hours later. Like I feel
hmm
an immediate spike in my anxiety as soon as it wears off. And so for me, it's just like, oh, I see how this could be addictive. I see how this is not worth it.
hmm
But oh, to be conditioned that deeply into dependence on such a hard drug.
and the doctors tell them as well. They go, "It's fine. Everyone takes these every day. It's not a big deal. Don't worry. We'll be able to get you off them later on." Because I mean, they're generalizing because, like I said, like a lot of people do take them every day, and then they come off them and they're fine. And so they generalize it, but without knowing that there's a growing number of people who it's not easy for, and it's really, really bad. And so what do you do when there's a group of people who really don't do well with the rapid withdrawal? You kind of have to do it for everyone because the consequences of not doing it properly, like, are so life changing. That kind of needs to be the norm. It's this, 5 to 10% cuts every 2 to 4 weeks, checking in with them closely. If it gets too much, you kind of slow the rate down. I mean, that's the general philosophy on how to do it safely, and that should be done for everyone. The same thing happens for antidepressants as well. Everything I just said about benzos holds true for antidepressants. A small group of people causes some structural brain changes. If they're pulled out too quickly, they become toxic, and then even if you reintroduce the drug, they're still completely debilitated. Um,
Mm.
and they do the same thing, that they have to do that gradual taper, and it recovers over many months to sometimes many years.
So I have three questions for you on antidepressants. I just have so many. I'm trying to keep track of them all.
Yeah.
Let me just review them all now. One is, what about lamotrigine? Because I saw that you did an interview about that, and it's different from your usual SSRIs. Another is the birth control to antidepressant pipeline. And then finally, the thing that I originally got in touch with you about is the post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. So are any of those particularly calling to you?
Yeah, I think probably the middle two, I would say. I mean, so there's pssd. What was the second one you said again?
So first I said lamotrigine, then the
Yeah.
birth control to antidepressant pipeline.
Birth control. Okay. So the lamotrigine one, we'll get that out of the way quickly. There's nothing that special about lamotrigine. The withdrawal symptoms are usually like massive fatigue and things like that. Lamotrigine is like a slightly different drug, but the same principles like apply to tapering it. We'll just go in order. I think they're all kind of interesting. So
Mhm.
the oral contraceptive pill to psychiatric medication kind of pipeline, it's kind of like the caffeine to psychiatric medication pipeline, or the nicotine to
Hey,
psychiatric medication
stop taking
pipeline. Yeah,
jabs at my drug of choice.
yeah. No, I will. It's the thing is, it's fine for a lot of people, and you got to
Mm.
appreciate that nuance. And that there's a lot of people on caffeine. It's doing no problems to them at all. They'll come off and they'll be like, "This sucks. Put me back on it." My life didn't get any better. But and so that's the same with the oral contraceptive pill. There are a group of people, and you can look in the drug labels for these things, that have worsening depression and anxiety when they take it. These are hormone modulating drugs. They're neuroendocrine products, and they make people depressed and anxious, sometimes to the point where they unexpectedly become suicidal. How do you know if this is happening to you? You take the drug, typically within the first couple of months, you start noticing unexpected changes in your mood. Oh, you're more irritable than normal, you're more depressed, you're more anxious. Look at the context of the person's life, look at the context of your life. If it's not lining up with some new stressor, you're probably having an adverse drug reaction. And if you go and see like a doctor that's not aware of this, they go, you're a young person, a lot of depression and anxiety starts around that time. Let's just pop you on some Lexapro, And if you're already having an adverse reaction and now you're on Lexapro, maybe it makes your irritability worse. Maybe you become disinhibited in some way. Actually, now I can really see what was going on. You were developing bipolar disorder, and now we need to get you on some Seroquel, and then and a psychiatric patient is born. So
Yeah.
um, that's really how it happens. I mean, it can happen with a lot of other drugs as well. Common ones could be things like Singulair, which is that asthma drug, and also it's used for allergic rhinitis. There's prominent psychiatric side effects with that, which people aren't aware of. Accutane is the other big one as well, that medication. They have a big warning about don't take Accutane when if you're sexually active, because it causes birth defects, and that should be there. But the other big warning for Accutane should be, monitor your mood carefully, because it can make people the same thing, depressed, anxious, irritable, and it can be super confusing. And there's a whole host of other drugs out there, like different types of antibiotics and anti-malarial drugs, and there's a million of them that have these subtle psychiatric things that if you're not clued in and knowing what they're doing, you could become a psychiatric patient without even knowing.
As a therapist, I've gotten an up close and personal view at what people tend to struggle with day in and day out. Turns out it's almost universal that we know we should be taking better care of ourselves in terms of the basic building blocks of well being, like diet and exercise. But as valuable as it is for our mental and physical health to change our lifestyle habits, it's also much easier said than done. People often set goals that are too lofty, only to feel even worse about themselves when their aspirations inevitably fail. That's why I recommend starting with positive changes that are as simple as possible. Enter my new favorite beverage line. Organifi makes it so easy to improve your nutrition and start feeling better right now, with refreshing plant-based blends of superfoods and adaptogens that you can just mix with water. My personal favorite is their green juice. It contains moringa, ashwagandha, chlorella, spirulina, wheatgrass, beets, turmeric, mint, lemon, and coconut water. 100% organic with no added sugar, and it tastes great. My family loves Organifi Gold, which promotes relaxation and restful sleep, served mixed with warm almond milk before bed. Organifi also makes several other powerful blends, all organic and loaded with vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, phytonutrients, anti inflammatory herbs, and adaptogens. For less than $3 and 3 grams of sugar per serving, you can start giving your cells the support they need to manage stress and feel good. Check out their product line at Organifi.com. That's spelled Organifi.com. And use promo code SOMETherapist to get 20% off your entire order. Your whole body will thank you. I want to comment on this as a woman because, again, I have a highly sensitive nervous system. I feel things before they reach the magnitude that a lot of other people feel them, for better or for worse. It's a gift and a curse. And so for me, whenever I've tried taking anything that alters my hormones, it makes me feel crazy. I mean, I remember the first time I tried hormonal birth control, I could not stop crying for a week. And it was like, okay, I know I'm a sensitive person, but this is a little excessive. And I started to feel like I was being poisoned by these excessive amounts of my own sex hormones in my system. And so I stopped. And I know a lot of women don't have that effect. Some even feel like birth control levels out their mood. But given that that's my own experience, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in my clinical practice that I meet a young woman in her teens or 20s who started taking birth control within the first, let's say, year or two after menarche or after the onset of menstruation. So she might have been 12, 13, 14, 15 when she started taking birth control, not because she was sexually active in most cases, usually because she was having acne or painful periods. And so birth control is just sort of handed out to these girls very readily, like this will control your acne, this will make your periods lighter, or you can not have them at all, or make, and so it's just given as this solution. And because adolescence is this destabilizing time with the onset of hormones and all the social stuff going on, it's also, like you said, just a time that a lot of girls present with depression and anxiety. And so then they get put on antidepressants, and it's never evaluated whether the birth control might have something to do with why she is such an emotional wreck. And then I see her 10 years later. I see her at 24 in my office, and she has been on birth control and antidepressants for her entire young adulthood, since puberty all the way until through college. And then there's a question of, does she feel like she knows herself, right? There is that emotional numbing. We also know that birth control impacts women's sexual attraction. So for anyone looking for resources on that, Dr. Sarah Hill has a really good book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. So who a girl is even romantically interested in, all of this kind of stuff can be impacted. And so I'm glad that you said something about it. It sounds like you've also observed that it's not just hormonal birth control. It's actually a lot of drugs that aren't, that the reason they're prescribed isn't psychiatric, but they can end up having these psychiatric impacts.
And I know, I mean, when you think about drugs in a young person, whether maybe it's a hormonal birth control that's having mood altering effects, but especially an antidepressant, if it goes along with that, what does that do to someone's maturation when, maybe they're less interested in the opposite sex, or, whoever they want their partner to be romantically, in general. And then, so you've taken someone in this critical period of their life and you've blunted them to the extent that, it's harder for them to form relationships in this critical period where, I mean, men and women, I mean, we don't really know how to have relationships until we have them. I mean, you want to be in them and learning about the other person, and you want to be able to have sexual relationships and figure all of that stuff out. It's quite possible that you hit the pause button in many ways on someone's emotional maturation when you throw a drug in there that cranks the volume down to such a degree that 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 part is turned off, and maybe they don't have relationships, and maybe they don't have to figure difficult things out like conflict in the same way that they would, because maybe they just put up with a lot of shit that they normally wouldn't have because they kind of blunted out, and maybe that was their pathology to begin with, and maybe that was the thing that a therapist should have been working with them on, is how to stand up for yourself and get yourself out of an abusive relationship. And you hit the pause button on that, And this person wakes up at 35 with the emotional maturation of like a 16-year-old, and they just go, excuse me, can I have like the last 15 years of my life back? Why did everyone cheerlead me onto these drugs? And now you're looking at people around you and it's like what happened to me? I mean, that's the worst case scenario. I know I'm painting a bleak picture. There are some people that get on these medications, it's totally fine, and they go through all of these things, but there's people who don't. And there's people that happens to. And if someone is not watching out for that, it's, I mean, it's really sad. I mean, it makes me feel sad thinking about it. Hear that a lot. I see it a lot.
Yeah, wow. The impact on one's sense of self and ambitions and relationships. There are stories of women getting into relationships with men while they were on birth control, and then they go off of birth control because they're ready to have a baby with him, and suddenly they're not attracted to him anymore.
Yeah.
Um, all right, let's move on to post.
Well, I was
Oh,
going to say, before we
yep.
go there, we'll get to PSSD.
Uh-huh.
I'll throw, a Molotov cocktail in here as
Ooh.
well, because I know you talk about the gender identity stuff as well. But why are there so many asexual people out there now as well? You know, is there an increase in people identifying as trans because it's more socially acceptable? Possibly, yeah, it's more in the news. But how about the fact that we're probably the most medicated adolescent generation that's ever been, and so many people are on drugs which completely zap someone's sexual drive? I mean, if I was a young person and I was just like, oh, wow, my friend over here is like, he's really like attracted to these people and he's going after it and they're doing it and it's just working for them, and it's not working for me. And in fact, I don't really feel these things and I'm struggling to have connections with people and I'm sad. Well, I'm going to put together the fact that I'm sad and that I'm not sexually attracted to anyone. And, oh, this person has been saying that, like, maybe I'm the wrong gender, you know, maybe I'm asexual. Like it's there's so many ways that this can play out into someone's identity. I talked to a lot of the PSSD guys, and this is a segue, who ended up thinking they were gay. They were just like, I'm trying to have sex with this girl I thought I would be attracted to. I cannot get it up. I'm not interested. Maybe I like guys. Like what that does to you, it's like, what a trip, and a bad one, a deeply confusing one. And so yeah, these things come and they can play out in like a million different areas.
Yeah, kids who have been on Zoloft, um, and or antidepressants since they were however old, and then they're not having those same feelings, combined with this highly sexualized environment where if you're a girl, you have to look like a porn star or an Instagram model only to be treated in a disrespectful manner, and if you're a guy you have to fit these stereotypes. It's no wonder that so many kids feel like I don't fit any of those things, or I want, a lot of girls also escaping into a transmasculine identity as a way of protecting themselves from being sexualized before they're ready, or in a way that feels invasive or unwanted to them. And
Hmm.
then, while we're talking about hormones, um, there's also the impact of puberty blockers on sexual development, right? Kids administered puberty blockers, according to WPATH guidelines, will never achieve sexual functioning. So we have to ask who would want that for a generation of children. And then the fact that people who are put on cross-sex hormones, there's been research on this, end up taking more psychiatric meds, not less, right? So the whole flawed hypothesis on which this gender medicine is based is that this is supposed to alleviate psychological distress in the long term. And we know that there is some short-term placebo effect for people who have built it up in their minds that this is going to be the solution. But if we look at the long term, we know that people who are put on prescriptions for cross-sex hormones are on higher doses of other psychiatric medications long term, which is one of the reasons that I felt stunted as a therapist when I was working with this population, because I was seeing people after they'd had surgical and hormonal interventions and they still had all these psychiatric symptoms. And I felt like I could never quite ask, had you hoped that this surgery or that these medications or that masculinizing yourself, had you hoped that that was going to make you a happier person, free of anxiety and depression, and we couldn't talk about that elephant in the room. Is that something that you're willing to comment on? Have you seen sort of the polypharmacy of people on cross-sex hormones?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the same. I mean, you pull up the drug labels for any of these things, it should be well known for like anyone prescribing these things that they cause an absolute emotional roller coaster for this vulnerable group of people who are typically very depressed and anxious. Many of them have trauma and different things going on as well, and they're going making these massive decisions about taking cross-sex hormones or going reassignment surgery and things like that, and then you put them in an emotional roller coaster as well by giving them hormones and starting them and stopping them. It's massively. I mean, it has to be done by someone really skilled. It's not a light decision to take these things. I mean, many of these people who are thinking about this. I mean, they're already unhappy to the point where they've likely already had a suicide attempt or they've been thinking about suicide. That's the kind of sadness that you need, I think, to get to the point where you're like, maybe I need to do something this drastic. And then the solution to that is to put them on drugs that can destabilize their mood.
Mm.
And so it's it doesn't surprise me that that when people kind of go through it, it's not, we're not hearing like headlines saying, oh, gender reassignment surgery, it's all positive, people feel like 1,000 times better afterwards. It's like they're now on like hormones that are destabilizing for the mood. And there's maybe for some people it's not a problem, but there's going to be a group in there who are just not doing well because of that. And then they're not doing well. Oh, okay, instead of looking at the hormones, because we're not going to touch that because we don't want to be stigmatizing or make things more difficult for you. It's okay, we got something else. Let's stack some Lexapro, and then you're going down that pathway now, and that's really easy to start accumulating several drugs that way as well.
And so here's a segue between that subject and PSSD, which is the
Hmm.
reality for a lot of these males. So we know from the research of people like Ray Blanchard and James Cantor that amongst the males with gender dysphoria, they typically fall into one of two categories. Now we are seeing a younger cohort emerging that is more the ROGD and doesn't fit the classical pattern, but there's basically the autogynephilic and the homosexual transsexuals. And so for the men for whom there's autogynephilia, which there's a high comorbidity rate there with narcissistic personality disorder, as one would expect, because it's, translation, falling in love with yourself as the
Okay.
opposite sex, right? So for men who have that autogynephilic fetish, where for them it's a sexual fetish where they feel aroused by the idea of themselves as a woman, and then they're given this misinformation about about sexuality and gender and all of that. They're told that they can become a woman. Then they pursue cross sex hormones or surgeries, and those kill their sex drive. So this is a frequent complaint, right? Whether it's that they've had, let's say, an orchiectomy, and then they're no longer able to have sex because they don't have a drive or they can't get it up for that reason, or men who are taking estrogen and now they're experiencing erectile dysfunction or lack of sex drive from that. So a lot of these trans-identified males end up kind of caught up in this loop where what drives them into it is their sex drive. But then once they pursue these irreversible medical interventions, the very thing that drove them into it is now no longer available to them, and they're kind of in this no man's land.
Yeah, with like no doctors to help them, it's just like the people that everything's going to be like fine on the other side, and then, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I guess the segue into the sexual
Sexual
problems, right?
dysfunction, yeah,
Yeah, like
PSSD.
so PSSD, it's uncommon. There's tens of thousands of people come off antidepressants every single year, no problems. Sex drive comes back within a couple of weeks, sometimes a couple of months. But there is a group of people who have what appears to be permanent sexual dysfunction or sexual dysfunction that heals very slowly over time. The um, the problem with the term PSSD is that it's a much broader constellation of symptoms. When you talk to the people who have this condition who are really sick, they're not just, I mean, they don't even really care so much about the sexual problems. They have neurological problems, which they care about a lot. they experience such a sense of derealization and disconnection from the world, which is kind of like an exaggerated effect of these drugs to begin with. They feel so disconnected emotionally from what's happening in their environment that they feel like they're watching a movie. Oh, maybe that doesn't sound that bad. Yeah, maybe not for like an hour or two, but if that's like your life and your like daughter comes and gives you a hug or your wife gives you a hug and you feel nothing, or someone in your family dies and you're so shut down from your emotions, that's nothing there. It's not even worth living at that point. A life without emotions is really sad. And so they have a massive amount of emotional blunting and derealization. And then also there's this, in the ones that are really sick, they have a hard time concentrating as well. Cognitively, they've taken a bit of a hit. And so that's the constellation. It's massive emotional blunting and detachment, plus you know inability to have an orgasm, maintain an erection, achieve lubrication, or do any of those things. That all of that kind of turns off. And some people gradually get better over time, but there's some people who've had this for like decades now. The other thing is, I mean, this is such a horrific thing to happen to people. You got to think about the practice of putting like 10, 12-year-old kids on this, teenagers on this, that you know were broken up with, college kids that move away from their parents, to a new city, and they're sad because it's a big life change. Someone who loses a job, someone going through a divorce. Again, like, what do you do when something is uncommon like this and it's not happening to everyone? I think you've got to tell everyone about it. There is a rare chance, we do not know how big it is, that if you start this drug, it may cause sexual dysfunction that may never go away. And I don't think this means that people never take it, but you need to integrate that into your decision making. It's like, and that's why I'm saying, like, if you do have severe depression and anxiety and it's coming out of nowhere, or maybe you're trapped in a situation where you cannot change your contextual stresses and you're at the point where you want to end your life, take it. The risk benefit equation is in your favor in there, especially if it's rare. You can take that medication, but these days it's so easy for someone to just walk in and just say, hey, I'm just like having a hard time because XYZ contextual stressor that is going to go away in a couple of months easily. It's normal. Or if it's not, hey, we'll send you to a therapist and they'll help you get through it. They will guide you through it. That doesn't happen anymore frequently. People just go in and they see their doctor, they tell them, hey, it's okay. Everyone takes these medications, it'll be right. And they just put them on them. And people are feeling massively betrayed and let down by their providers for not informing them on just how bad things can get.
Is there anything that is predictive of who's most likely to have this permanent sexual dysfunction, like maybe the length of time on the meds or any demographic issues?
No, there's nothing, and it kind of, and there's nothing for the benzo withdrawal problems or the antidepressant withdrawal problems, or really any of the side effects, because that's not how things work in drug research. If you have a rare side effect like of a drug that's not that uncommon, you have to kind of scoop all these people up and put them in a study and sequence their genome, track all of their their defining characteristics and do some kind of analysis. No one's paying for that. No one's going to do it. FDA doesn't care. Like, pharmaceutical company doesn't care. It's expensive to do that. They just put it in the label, and then the people who have been hurt are just kind of on their own. And so there's never going to be any kind of investment in developing protective risk factors for these horrific, more uncommon side effects. And
That's scary.
it's super scary, right? Yeah. Because everything drug research wise is skewed towards approval. We're going to do our double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, and we'll collect the stuff on the common side effects, the common ones that happen while that's going on. But the rare severe ones, like, there's no regulatory mandate. They're not making people do these studies. And another interesting one is for tardive dyskinesia. If you haven't heard of that one, it's that facial movement and sometimes global body movement from antipsychotic medications. So people who are on chronic antipsychotic medication for schizophrenia, they develop facial movements at a rate of 1 in 20 per year. It's 5% incidence. This has been happening since the 50s. This is a horrific thing to happen to someone on these medications, like a permanent movement disorder, like where you look like the Joker from the Batman movie with like a facial twitch the whole time. It's very bad for someone's self-esteem. There's no predictive studies on this, and I mean this drug has been used for like 70 years, and so there's just a general lack of interest in really getting to the bottom of these things, in terms of funding. And I'm not holding my breath for anything to change soon. So it's just, you just have to be cautious. There's no predictive risk factors. Just know it's a risk that cannot be predicted, and you better make sure it's worth it if you're going to start one of these things.
So you've said that you're not 100% anti-psychiatric meds, that there are times that the risk-benefit analysis would suggest that it is worth it for someone. And something that you've mentioned a few times in this conversation is that if someone is feeling suicidal, then certainly it's better to take a drug that has some side effects or risks than to take your life. And I can't imagine there's anyone who would disagree with that. That being said, though, from a glance at your YouTube channel, I certainly haven't watched all your videos. I know you also talk about how increased suicidal ideation is actually another risk with some of these drugs. And we hear that in the drug commercials too, right? That there are drugs people take for depression, that to alleviate their suicidal ideation that actually make it worse. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, so I mean, they're what I would call paradoxical reactions. So when you put someone on an antidepressant, like the majority of people are going to have the intended therapeutic effect, which is a mood constriction without worsening suicidal thoughts. Again, for reasons we don't understand and that we cannot predict, some people become more depressed and more agitated. And that doesn't, so when I say they increase the risk of suicidal ideation, that's not globally. It just means that there's some people in that group that are susceptible to responding to them in a bad way. And that risk can just be mitigated by being aware of it, asking those questions, wow, you seem more irritable, you're more moody recently. You recently had a dose change or started this medication. Like, is anything else going on in your life that could explain this? If the answer is no, get them off that drug. But a lot of the times people they're too busy, or they just say, oh, it's just depression, and they jack up the dose, and the person ends up, sometimes harming themselves, or sometimes being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and just being really confused about, oh, I guess I'm really mentally ill because now I'm doing these unpredictable things that are outside of my personality. So, I mean, that's drug safety for you. It's never like global. Everyone responds to things in different ways. You just need to know the whole profile. So when you give someone a drug, you're at least looking for these things. And yeah, times that I use psych drugs, because I know this whole podcast is about, let Josef scare you about psychiatric medications. Like, here are the times that I would use it. Antidepressants, I mean, you got to have severe chronic depression and anxiety that's not responding to addressing contextual stresses, diet, stopping things like drugs and alcohol that can mess with it. If it's at that point, and it's at the point where like you're so anxious and depressed that you can't work or you can't do anything, take it. You might be able to work. You may be able to actually have a good relationship. If you have this like crazy anxiety, just go for it. I mean, it outweighs the risks for that person, because the risks, they are uncommon. Massive chance it's not going to happen to you, and this will just be a gift in your life. For bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, I think we'll go bipolar first. If you're having a manic episode and you're agitated and you're in a psychiatric unit and you're harming people around you because you're psychotic, I would sedate that person. I would sedate them with large amounts of Zyprexa, and I would bring them down. It is not practical in this day and age to let this burn out. Where are you going to put this person where they're not going to harm themselves or others while they're doing it? There's no place to put them. You couldn't pay for it. They have to be in these contained kind of untherapeutic box-like settings and sedated and monitored. That's fine. Schizophrenia as well. If you have chronic psychosis and you need to use an antipsychotic because otherwise you're constantly coming back into the hospital, there's risks with that. But that if that keeps you at a level where you're more functional and maybe your family is better able to kind of keep you in their home and care for you in that situation, go for it. severe autism as well. What are the options for these people with severe autism and dementia? Like sometimes it's just using these drugs to kind of keep their behavior under control so their families can care for them. Because when the families don't, I mean, they end up in group homes and different places like that where the care is suboptimal. And so it's really challenging knowing when to use them. But there is a use case scenario for all of these drugs, and you really can extract the benefit from them if you are aware of the risks and if people are informed and things like that. And the other thing is like bipolar disorder. Do you keep people on these drugs chronically? I wouldn't want to do that for most people. I'm going to treat them when they're manic. I'm going to pull them off the drug. And unless they're like manic all the time, I'm not going to put them on it, because the risk of me destroying their kidneys and their thyroid with lithium, or causing liver damage with Depakote, or making them obese with Zyprexa or Seroquel, it's huge. So I don't think anyone should really like there's some guidelines out there. Oh, you have 2 episodes, be on it for life. It's not that simple in the real world. When you're talking to people, you need to see
Mm-hmm.
how the actual individual values, like their functioning, how bad the flare-ups are, and the profile. You need to adapt to the person across the table from you.
Yeah,
So
bipolar seems like what really kind of in between, because there
yeah,
is an element of psychosis in the worst manic states. And yes, people who are bipolar can be a risk to themselves and others, but at the same time, there there are high functioning people with bipolar. There are people who meet criteria for bipolar who do mature out of it. And sometimes people go through what seems like manic or depressive phases in response to life stressors. I've definitely seen trauma trigger manic behavior. Um, and so it seems from what I know about bipolar that if you can get someone to regulate their sleep without use of a lot of medications for that, then you've solved half the battle, because bipolar is it's partly a sleep and energy regulation disorder.
yeah. I'm going to
Is that
tell them
your
they need to stop caffeine. Yeah, 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 totally. And and I'm going to say this: the most common reason for bipolar disorder these days, it's adverse drug reactions. This is a rare condition. In the past, like when you look at the data for the people who are going into the hospitals with those diagnoses compared to today, the only way I can understand it is that people having adverse reactions to antidepressants, where it's like 1 in 10 in the U.S. population were taking them for a prolonged period of time in recent years. I mean, it's that they're that commonly used. So that would be like the main thing. It's like, we're not going to do anything to this person. We're going to give them some Ativan to help them sleep, and we're just not going to put them on Lexapro. We're just going to like let them kind of come back together.
Wow. We have covered a lot of ground. I am so excited about this interview. I can't wait to see all the little clips that we're going to pull out from all these great moments. I learned so much, and I trust that our listeners did too if they made it all the way through. And I can't imagine why they wouldn't want to, because chock full of information. Excellent conversation. Thank you so much. So let's talk about the places people can find you. Your
Mhm.
podcast, Life on Less Meds. Can people find that anywhere podcasts are found?
It's on all podcasting platforms. But probably my main channel for most of it, the one that's kind of the busiest, is YouTube. It's Witt-Doerring Psychiatry. Um, and then I guess if you are someone who's having a severe adverse reaction, or you're on multiple medications and you need to come off them, you could come and look at my private practice. That's wittdoerringpsychiatry.com. And we work in several states: California, Texas, Utah, coming soon in New York and Florida. And also we're in Pennsylvania. So um, that's where I would go to find us if you are in that situation and you want help coming off medications.
So, although you and your wife are in Utah, you have licenses to work in all of those states as well. That's
Correct. Yeah.
that's a great resource.
Licenses, DEAs. I mean, we were really founded as like a benzo deprescribing practice, but we've kind of we do the whole thing now. We quickly realize people aren't coming to us just on benzos, they're coming to us on 5 or 6 different medications. And so we do the whole thing now.
It's a really wonderful service that you're offering. And thank you so much for being brave and trusting your gut and learning everything you can so that you can help people with these issues.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, great talking to you.
Great talking to you as well. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. To check out my book recommendations, articles, wellness products, guest episodes on other podcasts, consulting services, and lots more, visit sometherapist.com or follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you'd like to go deeper, join my community at somekindoftherapist.locals.com. Members can dialogue with other listeners, post questions for upcoming podcast guests to respond to, or ask questions for me to respond to in exclusive members-only Q&A live streams. To learn more about the gender crisis, watch our film, No Way Back, The Reality of Gender-Affirming Care at nowaybackfilm.com. Special thanks to my producers, Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix, and to Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. If you appreciate this podcast and want more people to find it, kindly take a moment to rate, review, like, comment, and share on your platforms of choice. Of course, just because I am some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.